Lone drifter married a widow until he found her dead husband's boots by the bed. Samuel Hayes had buried 3 men in his lifetime. But the woman counting coins with trembling fingers would teach him that sometimes the living carry more ghosts than the dead. The dust in Bitter Creek settled on everything like forgotten prayers, coating the wooden storefronts in a film of amber resignation. Samuel Hayes rode into town with nothing but a worn saddle, a horse that wheezed with each step, and the kind of hunger that gnawed at a man's bones until he forgot what it felt like to be full. The war had ended 3 years ago, but still lived in his shoulders in the way he held his head when thunder rolled across the desert sky. The general store squatted at the end of the main street like a tired old woman, its paint peeling in long strips that curled in the heat. A hand-painted sign above the door read Cortez Mercantile in faded letters, and beneath it a smaller sign, We extend credit to those with honest faces. Samuel dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with the weight of a man who had walked too many miles on empty promises. The store's interior was cool and dark, smelling of coffee beans and saddle soap, of flour and the particular mustiness that came from dreams deferred. Behind the counter stood a woman whose beauty struck him like a physical blow. Not the painted beauty of saloon girls, but something deeper, carved by loss into something both fragile and unbreakable. Elena Cortez had the kind of face that told stories without speaking, dark eyes that held depths Samuel couldn't fathom, and hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to count every penny twice. Her black hair was pulled back severely, but rebellious strands escaped to frame her face, and when she looked up at him, Samuel felt something in his chest that had been quiet for too long stirred to life. "Buenos dias," she said, her English accented but clear. "What can I help you with?" Samuel removed his hat, suddenly conscious of the dust that clung to him like a second skin. "Coffee, if you have it. Beans, flour, whatever you can spare for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the few coins that represented everything he owned in the world. Elena's eyes flickered to the money, then back to his face, and something passed between them, an understanding that only people who had known real hunger could share. She moved to gather his supplies, and Samuel noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she measured out the coffee beans, the way she bit her lower lip when she thought he wasn't looking. "Your husband around?" Samuel asked, trying to make conversation, trying not to think about how the afternoon light coming through the window turned her hair to silk. The measuring cup slipped from Elena's fingers, coffee beans scattering across the wooden floor like dark rain. She knelt to gather them, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Miguel, my Miguel died 2 months ago," she said, her voice breaking on his name like glass against stone. "Mining accident up in the hills. Cave-in took him and 4 other men." Samuel felt the familiar weight of shared loss settle between them. He had spoken those same words about his own ghosts, his brother Thomas, killed at Gettysburg, his father, who had died of heartbreak 6 months later, the Mexican boy he had shot outside El Paso, whose face still visited him in dreams. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. The words fell inadequate, but they were all he had. Elena stood, brushing dust from her dark skirts. "The store, it's too much for one person. The books, the inventory, the repairs that need doing." She gestured around them at the shelves that leaned slightly, the window frame that had warped in the heat. "I keep telling myself Miguel will walk through that door, complaining about the dust in his hair." Samuel looked at her hands, callous from work, marked with small cuts from handling inventory, but still graceful. He thought about the empty miles ahead of him, about sleeping under stars that offered no warmth, about the hollow echo of his own footsteps on lonely roads. "I know something about repairs," he said quietly. "Worked construction before the war. If you need help." Elena's eyes searched his face, looking for something, honesty, perhaps, or simply the absence of cruelty. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "I can't pay much," she said, "but there's a room above the store, and I cook enough for 2 out of habit." That evening, they shared coffee and cornbread at a small table behind the counter, the silence between them comfortable in a way that only comes between people who understand that words can sometimes wound more than they heal. Elena told him about Miguel, about their dreams of expanding the store, of the children they had hoped for, but never had. Samuel spoke little, but when he did, it was about the weight of carrying the past, about the way a man could lose himself in the spaces between one day and the next. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the empty streets of Bitter Creek, carrying with it the promise of storms and the scent of distant rain. Neither Samuel nor Elena spoke of the future. It seemed too fragile a thing to name aloud. But something had shifted in the dusty air between them, something that tasted of hope and felt dangerous as a loaded gun. As the last light faded from the windows, Samuel climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the store. And for the first time in months, he fell asleep to the sound of someone else breathing in the same building. In her room below, Elena lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar comfort of footsteps overhead, wondering if God sometimes sent angels in the form of dusty drifters with kind eyes and careful hands. Neither of them could have imagined that beneath their tentative trust lay secrets that would test everything they were building together, secrets that waited like buried bones to claw their way back to the surface. Samuel thought he had married a widow, until he found another man's boots beneath their marriage bed, still warm with the heat of living feet and secrets that could destroy everything. 3 months had passed since Samuel Hayes first walked into the Cortez Mercantile, and in that time, something had grown between him and Elena like wildflowers after rain, tentative at first, then stronger, rooted in the kind of understanding that comes from shared silences and the daily rituals of survival. The store had become more than a business. It had become a home, with Samuel's careful hands repairing what time and neglect had broken, and Elena's voice filling the empty spaces with Spanish lullabies her mother had sung to her as a child. They had married on a Tuesday in October, when the desert air carried the promise of winter and the priest in Bitter Creek could finally be convinced to perform a ceremony for a Mexican woman and a gringo drifter. Father Martinez had blessed their union with wine that tasted like vinegar and words that felt like prayers, while the autumn wind served as their only witness, rattling the windows of the small church like applause from the angels. Elena had worn her mother's white lace mantilla, yellowed with age but still beautiful, and Samuel had bought a new shirt from the traveling merchant who passed through town once a month. They had no rings to exchange, so they pressed their palms together and spoke their vows in 2 languages, English and Spanish weaving together like braided rope, strong enough to hold whatever storms might come. The early days of their marriage had been painted in shades of contentment that Samuel had never known existed. Elena would wake before dawn to make coffee, the rich aroma drawing him from sleep like a benediction. She taught him Spanish words over breakfast, mi amor, corazón, casa, and he taught her to read the weather in cloud formations, to fix the temperamental cash register that stuck when the humidity was high. In the evenings, they would sit on the narrow porch behind the store, watching the sun die behind the mountains while Elena mended clothes and Samuel whittled small animals from pieces of discarded wood. Elena laughed when Samuel attempted to pronounce mañana, the word stumbling off his tongue like a colt learning to walk. Her laughter was music he had forgotten existed, and when she smiled, the lines of grief around her eyes softened into something that looked almost like joy. She had begun to set aside her widow's weeds, trading the severe black dresses for calico prints in soft blues and greens, colors that made her skin glow like burnished copper in the lamplight. At night, they lay together in the narrow bed that had once belonged to Elena and Miguel, and Samuel tried not to think about ghosts. Elena's body was warm against his, her breath soft on his neck, and in those moments he could almost convince himself that the past was truly buried, that love could grow in soil watered by tears and tended with careful hands. But on this particular evening in late December, as a cold wind howled down from the mountains and rattled the loose boards of the store, Samuel's world tilted off its axis and crashed into a truth he was not prepared to face. He had been looking for Elena's sewing basket, thinking to surprise her by mending a torn curtain while she prepared dinner. The basket was kept beneath the bed, pushed far back against the wall where dust gathered like forgotten dreams. Samuel knelt on the worn wooden floor and reached into the shadows, his fingers finding the familiar wicker handle. But his hand touched something else, leather, supple and warm, shaped by human feet and human sweat. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he pulled the objects into the lamplight, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. A pair of men's boots, brown leather worn soft with use, the soles marked with fresh mud that had not yet dried. The boots still held their shape, as if their owner had just stepped out of them moments before. Samuel's hands trembled as he examined them, noting the careful repairs in the leather, the way the laces had been tied, with the particular knot that men learned in the army. These were not the boots of a dead man. These were boots that had walked, recently and often, boots that carried the scent of the living and the weight of secrets. Samuel? Elena's voice drifted from the kitchen, light and musical. Dinner's ready, mi amor. Samuel set the boots carefully on the floor beside the bed, his mind racing like a spooked horse. The boots were clearly not his. His own pair sat by the door, caked with the dust of honest work. And they were too large for Elena's delicate feet, too masculine in their construction, too recent in their use to belong to a man who had been dead for 5 months. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face glowing with the warmth of the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour from making tortillas. When she saw Samuel kneeling beside the bed, saw the boots arranged on the floor like an accusation, her face went pale as winter moonlight. "Where did these come from?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. Elena's eyes flickered between Samuel's face and the boots, and he watched as a dozen emotions crossed her features: surprise, fear, something that might have been guilt. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles white with tension. Those are Miguel's boots," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kept them. For remembrance." Samuel stood slowly, his knees creaking like the old floorboards beneath his feet. He had held dead men's possessions before, had packed away the belongings of soldiers who would never again need them. He knew the difference between artifacts of grief and the tools of the living. "These boots have fresh mud on them, Elena," he said quietly. "The leather is still supple. They smell like—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "like a man who walked in them yesterday." Elena's composure cracked, like ice under pressure. "You don't understand," she said, tears gathering in her dark eyes. "There are things I cannot explain." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar sensation from his war days when he had learned to recognize the moment before everything went to hell. The boots sat between them like a chasm, their presence changing the very air in the room. "Try me," Samuel said, and in those 2 words was the weight of 3 months of trust, of shared coffee and whispered endearments, of a love that had grown in the desert of their mutual loneliness like a miracle neither of them had dared to hope for. Elena looked at him for a long moment, her eyes bright with tears and something deeper, a fear that seemed to reach all the way down to her bones. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered with a cry that sounded like grief made audible. The boots waited in the lamplight, holding their secrets like a loaded gun, while the 2 people who loved each other across the wreckage of their separate pasts stood frozen in a moment that would define everything that came after. Samuel followed his wife's footprints through the snow to an abandoned mine shaft and found a dead man sitting by a fire, eating bread she had baked that morning. The poison of suspicion burned through Samuel's veins like bad whiskey, transforming every shared glance into a question mark, every kindness into potential deception. For 2 weeks after discovering the boots, he watched Elena with the careful eyes of a hunter tracking wounded prey, noting things he had never seen before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The way she sometimes set 2 plates for dinner before catching herself with a startled laugh, claiming she had been thinking of her mother's old habits. The nervous glances she cast toward the mountains when thunder rolled across the desert sky, as if expecting something more than rain. How she startled at unexpected sounds. The creak of the store's front door, the whistle of the evening train, the cry of night birds hunting in the darkness beyond town. Samuel began to follow her. It started innocently enough, telling himself he was protecting her when she made her weekly trip to gather herbs in the foothills above Bitter Creek. But protection became surveillance, and surveillance became obsession, until he found himself crouched behind boulders like a common spy, watching his own wife move through the landscape with the purpose of someone carrying more than medicinal plants in her woven basket. Elena would disappear for hours among the scrub, oak, and granite outcroppings, following animal trails that seemed to lead nowhere. But Samuel had learned tracking from Apache scouts during the war, had learned to read the desert like scripture written in dust and stone. Her footprints told stories her lips would not, stories that led always in the same direction, toward the old Esperanza mine that had been abandoned since the cave-in that claimed 5 men's lives. On the third Thursday in January, when snow began to fall like ash from a dying fire, Samuel's patience finally shattered. He watched Elena leave the store with her basket and her careful lies about gathering winter sage, then followed her tracks through the white silence of the desert morning. The snow made tracking easy but dangerous. His own footprints would be just as visible to anyone who cared to look. The trail wound through arroyos carved by flash floods and summer storms, past the skeletons of cholla and the patient endurance of barrel cacti. Elena moved with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before, never hesitating at the countless branching trails that could lead a stranger astray. Samuel stayed far behind, using the skills that had kept him alive through 4 years of war, until the path finally terminated at a cluster of weathered wooden structures that marked the entrance to the Esperanza mine. From his hiding place behind a fallen cottonwood, Samuel watched Elena approach a mine shaft that should have been sealed, should have been a tomb for the men who had died in its depths. But someone had cleared the rockfall from its mouth, had built a rough wooden frame to shore up the entrance. And from deep within the mountain's belly came the faint glow of firelight and the impossible sound of a man humming a tune Samuel recognized, La Paloma, the dove song that Elena sometimes sang while she worked. Samuel's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Elena called out softly in Spanish, words that Samuel's limited vocabulary could not parse, and from the depths of the mine came an answering voice, rough with disuse, hoarse with emotion, but undeniably male. A voice that spoke Elena's name like a prayer answered, like resurrection made real. Elena, mi amor, trajiste pan. Samuel did not need to understand Spanish to recognize the intimacy in that voice, the familiarity of long love and shared secrets. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, muscle memory from the war taking over when his mind could not process what his senses were telling him. A figure emerged from the mine shaft, and Samuel's world tilted off its axis for the second time in 2 weeks. The man was tall and lean, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, his face marked by recent suffering but unmistakably alive. He wore the clothes of a working man, denim pants, a flannel shirt that had seen better days. And when he stepped into Elena's arms, Samuel could see the resemblance to the photograph that still sat on the store's counter. The wedding portrait of Elena and her husband that Samuel had been foolish enough to think showed a dead man. Miguel Cortez was very much alive. Samuel watched in horrified fascination as Elena unpacked her basket, sharing bread and coffee, dried meat and canned peaches. Enough food to sustain a man living rough, living hidden, living like a ghost in the mountains above the town that believed him dead. Miguel's hands shook as he ate, and Samuel could see the marks of hardship carved into his features, the sunken cheeks of chronic hunger, the nervous darting of eyes that had learned to expect danger from every shadow. They spoke in rapid Spanish, their voices carrying on the thin mountain air like smoke. Samuel caught fragments, la ley, the law, oro, gold, mito, fear, enough to understand that Miguel Cortez had not died in any mining accident, that the cave-in had been a story as carefully constructed as a coffin, a lie told to cover some greater truth that had driven a man to choose the half-life of hiding over the risk of facing whatever consequences awaited him in the world of the living. Elena wept as she held her husband, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the January cold. Miguel's scarred hand stroked her hair, and he whispered endearments that Samuel had thought belonged only to him. Words of love spoken in the language of a marriage that had never truly ended, only gone underground like water, following hidden channels through stone. Samuel remained motionless behind the fallen tree, his body cramped with cold and his heart cramped with a pain that had no name. He was watching the destruction of everything he had thought he understood about love, about loyalty, about the woman who had shared his bed and called him husband while her real husband lived like an animal in the mountains, sustained by her secret devotion and the bread she baked each morning in their shared kitchen. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elena packed the empty containers back in her basket and kissed Miguel goodbye with the desperate intensity of someone who never knew which goodbye might be the last. Miguel retreated into his cave like a wounded animal, and Elena began her journey back down the mountain, back to the store where Samuel waited, back to the life that was built on a foundation of necessary lies. Samuel waited until Elena was gone before he approached the mine shaft, his boots crunching in the snow that had begun to fall harder, erasing footprints and covering the evidence of what had transpired in this desolate place. At the mouth of the cave, he called out in English, his voice echoing off stone walls that had heard too many secrets. "I know you're in there, Miguel. We need to talk." The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley. Then, from the depths of the mine, came the scrape of boots on stone and the slow approach of a dead man, walking toward a conversation that would determine the fate of three souls bound together by love and deception, honor and betrayal, truth and the terrible weight of choices made in desperation. In the growing darkness, Samuel waited for Miguel Cortez to emerge from his tomb and wondered if some truths were too heavy for any of them to bear. Two men who loved the same woman stood face to face in a mine shaft, but only one of them would walk away, and the choice would break all their hearts forever. Miguel Cortez emerged from the mine shaft like a man rising from his own grave, his movements careful and deliberate, his hands empty but ready. In the dying light of the January afternoon, Samuel could see the full extent of what exile had done to Elena's first husband. The way his clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been solid with muscle, the deep lines carved around his eyes by months of looking over his shoulder, the tremor in his hands that spoke of constant fear made flesh. They stood 20 feet apart in the snow, two men bound together by love for the same woman and separated by circumstances neither had chosen. Samuel kept his hand near his gun, not from aggression but from habit, while Miguel raised his palms in the universal gesture of a man who had learned that survival sometimes meant surrender. "You are Samuel," Miguel said in heavily accented English, his voice rusty from disuse, but carrying the dignity of a man who had once commanded respect. "Elena speaks of you." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. Of course Elena spoke of him, to her real husband, in stolen moments when she brought food and comfort to the man she had never stopped loving, never stopped being married to in the eyes of God and her own heart. "She told you about me," Samuel said, and it wasn't a question. Miguel nodded slowly, his dark eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "She told me you were a good man, kind to her, that you make her laugh." Something that might have been pain flickered across his weathered features. "She has not laughed in a very long time." Samuel felt the anger that had been building for weeks drain out of him like water from a broken vessel. He had expected to find a villain, a deceiver, someone he could blame for the destruction of his happiness. Instead, he found a broken man who looked at him with something that resembled gratitude. "Why?" Samuel asked, the word echoing off the stone walls that surrounded them. "Why fake your death? Why put her through that grief?" Miguel's shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked older than his 40-odd years. "You know what they do to men who steal from the mining company? They do not wait for judges for trials. They make examples. He touched his throat with one scarred hand. I took gold, see? But not for greed. My Elena, she was sick that winter, needed medicine we could not afford. I thought I could take just enough, replace it when the next pay came. The confession hung in the cold air between them like smoke. Samuel understood desperation, understood the choices a man made when the woman he loved was dying and the law offered no mercy for the poor and the powerless. The foreman, he caught me, said he would see me hanged, but first he would make sure Elena lost everything, the store, the house, her reputation. Said he would make her pay for my crime. Miguel's voice broke on the words. So we made the plan. The cave-in, it was real, killed 4 men, nearly killed me. But Elena, she found me, helped me crawl out through the back shaft. We let them think I was buried with the others. Samuel closed his eyes, seeing the terrible logic of it, the way love could drive people to choose half-lives over no life at all. And Elena has been taking care of you ever since. She brings food, blankets. Tells me about the store, about you. Miguel's voice dropped to a whisper. About how you fix the shelves I never could repair, how you help her with the accounts, how you hold her when she cries in her sleep. The admission was like a knife between Samuel's ribs. Elena cried in her sleep, and he had thought it was grief for a dead husband. Instead, it was anguish for a living one, trapped between 2 impossible choices and slowly dying from the weight of them. She loves you, Miguel said simply. Not like she loves me. That is the love of youth, of children who grew up together and knew no other way. But she loves you like a woman loves a man who saves her from drowning, who gives her hope when hope seemed impossible. Samuel opened his eyes and looked at this ghost of a man, this living reminder of the price of survival in a world that offered no second chances. Then why didn't she tell me? Because she knows you are good, Miguel said, and there was no jealousy in his voice, only exhaustion. She knows you would try to help, would risk yourself for a man you never met, because that is who you are. And she has lost too much already to gamble with another person's life. The sound of horses echoed off the canyon walls, distant but growing closer, the steady rhythm of mounted men moving with purpose through the failing light. Miguel's head snapped up, his body tensing like a hunted animal's. Company men, he whispered. They come sometimes, checking the old mines. Elena must have been seen. Samuel made his choice in that moment, the kind of instant decision that defined a man's character and sealed his fate. There's a back way out. Miguel nodded, his eyes wide with desperate hope. Through the old shaft, but it comes out near the river. If they have men there, they don't, Samuel said with certainty he didn't feel. Take it. Head for Mexico. Don't stop, don't look back. But Elena, I'll take care of Elena. The words tasted like goodbye, like all the futures he was choosing not to have. She can't keep living like this, torn between 2 worlds. And you can't keep living like a ghost. Miguel stared at him for a long moment, understanding passing between them like a current. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age and wear. Give this to her, he said, pressing the jewelry into Samuel's palm. Tell her I release her. Tell her to be happy. The horses were closer now, close enough to hear the jingle of harness and the low voices of men who had come hunting. Miguel looked toward the back of the mine, then back at Samuel, his eyes bright with tears he was too proud to shed. Gracias, whispered, for loving her, for being the man I could not be. He disappeared into the darkness of the mine shaft like smoke, leaving only footprints in the snow and the warm weight of the locket in Samuel's hand. Samuel stood alone in the growing dark, listening to the approach of justice delayed but not denied, and felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace or might have been the acceptance that comes when a man finally understands the true price of love. When the company men arrived, they found Samuel Hayes standing in front of the mine entrance, his hands empty, his story simple. He had been tracking a wounded deer and taken shelter from the snow. They searched the shaft with torches and found nothing but old mining equipment and the echoes of their own voices. Later that night, Samuel sat in the store with Elena, watching her face crumble as he told her about Miguel's escape, about his final message, about the choice that had been made for all of them. She held the locket against her heart and wept for the boy she had married and the man he had become, for the love that had saved him and the love that had let him go. "He is free," she said finally, her voice steady despite her tears. "So are you," Samuel replied, though they both knew freedom was just another word for the space left behind when something precious was lost forever. Outside, snow continued to fall on the empty desert, covering tracks and filling the spaces where footprints had marked the passage of a ghost returning to the world of the living, while those left behind learned to build new lives from the ashes of old dreams and the terrible, redemptive weight of choices made in love.